HS 358D students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. We are now in week 8, and with week 8 there's obviously a lot going on. Thanks to most of you for getting your writing assignments in on time, however you managed to get it to me on time, whether you emailed it to me directly before the deadline, whether you submitted it incorrectly as a draft, or submitted it correctly as for grading by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on October the 23rd. You still got it to me on time. For those of you who felt the need to resubmit after submitting as a draft and realizing that you submitted it not quite correctly or not completely, I already accounted for that because I actually have access to your document, to your essay, whether or not you submitted it correctly. So for those of you who've been concerned about, well, I submitted it, but it's not late, and I want credit for the fact that I originally submitted it this time, but I submitted it incorrectly, it's okay. I saw, I'm grading by the spirit of what I'm saying in terms of being on time, but not literally by the letter. If I grade it by the letter of the law, probably about a quarter of you would not get, would lose 11 points. Some of you are still going to lose 11 points anyway, right? Because you either didn't submit it at all, and you didn't have an extension to begin with, or in some cases, or in some cases, when you first submitted it, your original submission was actually late, just late, period. And the rule is if you don't have an extension and you submit late, you lose 11 points. If you had submitted it at least as a draft before the deadline, and then ended up resubmitting, as some of you did, about 4 or 5 of you ended up doing that for whatever reason, glitches, whatnot. You're fine. But if you just submitted it and you were just late, you lose points. It's that simple. So some of you are still going to lose points anyway regarding that. But for the most part, I'm pleased with the fact most of you got it in on time, so that's good. I will try to grade these with some expedition, with some speed, because you also have group or individual freestyle assignment project proposal due by the end of this week, by this Sunday, October the 30th, which I'll talk about momentarily. And so, oh yeah, one other thing before I even get to that. Several of you submitted in PDF form, even though it literally says on the assignment in every other space where you have to submit only as a Word file. I'm not taking 11 points off, but you will lose points because I can't grade it this way. I can't give feedback. I can't give commentary if you're just sending it to me as a PDF. I mean, I don't understand. It literally says Word. It says submit as a Word document. I don't understand how PDF equals a Word document. But all right. So anyway, you have a project proposal due. No more than groups of 4. I don't care if you're all friends or not. As far as I care, if you all end up like fighting each other, becoming enemies by the end of the project, that's on you, right? But or as an individual, I left it as a choice because some of you probably don't want to work with other people and don't like doing it. Not everyone likes doing group projects. But the point of this project is to take an artifact and do something creative with it from historical standpoint, right? And your artifact can be anything, right? You can talk about Frederick Douglass's speech on the 4th of July. You can talk about Phillis Wheatley's poems. You can talk about the Declaration of Independence and what that means in terms of black freedom or lack thereof, on voting rights and lack thereof. You can talk about the U.S. Constitution and how it treats other persons, and the language it uses to avoid talking about slavery avoid talking about slavery as much as possible. The Missouri Compromise. You can talk about Harriet Jacobs' memoirs about having been enslaved. You can talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, conversely. There's a lot that you could talk about in terms of an artifact and trying to relate it to a specific event, specific process, specific trend in African American history for the time period that we covered. There's a lot there. You can also take something from today and use it to sort of interrogate the past in a creative sort of way. I don't know I don't know how Fujiwara relates to the second, the second Middle Passage to domestic slave trade in the United States between roughly 1800 and 1860, and especially between 1830 and 1860 or not. But I mean, it's something to think about, right? How does that relate? You could do everything. You could rewrite words for the lyrics for a particular song and make it so that it does reflect, Phyllis Wheatley's thinking or Frederick Douglass's thinking or, excuse me, Harriet Tubman's thinking or Sojourner Truth's thinking for that matter, right? You can do that. You can take something from today. You can take a family heirloom, say it's a picture of your family from 100 years ago, and think about what that means to have people in that picture who were enslaved in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and somehow they made it to 60 years old or 70 years old in this picture. But these are people who actually survived the held at slavery, and does it show? I mean all those kinds of things. But you can do this in the form of podcasts. If you're doing multiple people, you can do podcasts. You can have a debate about the significance of different things in African American history for different periods, using such artifacts either from the present to reform the past or from the past in terms of interpreting those things. You can write song, you can do rap, you can dance, you could reenact it in the form of a play. Whatever it is that you want to do that sort of reflects your creativity as well as your knowledge of and wanting more knowledge of a particular topic or a particular point or particular event in African American history that we've either covered or covered but not covered in the detail that you would want, right? So it's pretty wide open. And it's wide open again for a reason, so that you are doing what you want to do in order to get the grade, do the best job you can to get the grade that you want, right? Not because so I tell you, remember these 15 different things, spit them out on a piece of paper and get an A. This is not transactional, no matter how much you want it to be transactional. And I'm not just a customer service representative, I'm your professor, trying to make sure that you learn stuff, not only stuff that I'm teaching you, but you're applying it in ways so that you're learning it for you too, not just for me. So I keep saying that. No one seems to believe me on that, but that's what I've been doing for the most part for the better part of 30 years. So I hope that people eventually will get that. But that's really what I'm trying to do. So, anyway, that's what I'm expecting in terms of ideas and proposals. I've already talked to you about what we're doing regarding that. And then finally, we are doing Zoom for tomorrow. Tomorrow, Tuesday, October the 25th, 2022. I will be doing Zoom classes all day. They will all be at least 40 minutes. I think I'm limited to 40 minutes because our institution refuses to do more than that because that requires a subscription. And since everyone thinks that we're out of the pandemic, teachers apparently don't need more than 40 minutes to talk with their students anymore, even though normally it's an hour. I'll try if it lets me go past to an hour, I'll do the full hour, but we'll do at least 40 minutes in each of my classes tomorrow. So we'll see what happens with that. I'm going to reiterate some of the things that I'm about to say about week 8, but mostly I'm going to try to cover things I didn't cover in summary for week 8. So, and that's just for tomorrow. Thursday, we will be back to normal in-person appearances on Thursday, unless I'm informed enough from this experience that I should keep doing it somehow for Thursday. We'll probably meet again in person next Tuesday on the 1st of November. After that, I'll try to reassess to see if we need to continue to do Zoom classes. The main reason I'm doing this is because of low attendance. In both of my sections of African American history, there's been a gradual decrease of attendance over the past month. Some days, maybe a third of students have shown up for class. I've had at least 4 or 5 classes in the last month where attendance has been below 35%, meaning about a third of students, less than a third of students, around a third have shown up. So That tells me that some people have been sick, some people are disengaged, some people have had mental health issues, some people it's been a combination of at least two of those things. So with all of that, I want to make sure that I can reach everybody in the best ways possible. So mixing in some Zoom might be a good thing. Unfortunately, with Zoom, because I know not everyone has Microsoft Teams, not everyone knows how to use Microsoft Teams, and unfortunately Loyola is not supporting directly using Zoom these days, even though they say they are. The 40-minute limit's an example of how they're not really supporting it. So anyway, so today I want to talk to you about week 8. What are we doing week 8? Week 8 is really a combination of two things. It's a combination of the rise of King Cotton. And what the rise of King Cotton does to reinvigorate slavery as an institution, especially in the South, but really for the United States as a whole. And with the reinvigoration of slavery, coming things like the Second Middle Passage, the domestic slave trade, that eventually sends a million African Americans, a million slave black folk from upper South states like Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., the district, because there were actually slaves living in the district at the time, and Virginia, further south to the new territories that would eventually become Kentucky and Tennessee, and then eventually Alabama and Mississippi, and then eventually Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri, and eventually Texas and other places, to the point where by the time you get to the 1850s and 60s, you've got folks moving their enslaved folk across borders to territories like Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory, and Utah, and other parts of the West where you don't think cotton would grow, but they're going to give it a try anyway, right? So that's the reality of the expansion of slavery, and make no bones about this. The expansion of slavery in the South is not just a Southern thing. Without the expansion of slavery into the Deep South, the Industrial Revolution that needs things like raw cotton to turn into cloth textiles, which is the first Industrial Revolution, not only for the United States, not only for industries in up north and in New York and in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts, where there are factories making cloth, but for the shipping industry, shipping raw cotton and cloth overseas to the UK and other parts of Europe. The UK becomes extremely dependent on cheap cotton from the South in order to sustain its textile industries, and they are the biggest player in the Industrial Revolution because that's where it starts first. They're number one in terms of in terms of the economies of the world in the 19th century. The U.S. takes time to catch up. It catches up mostly through the advancement of textiles as industries in places like New York and Boston, in western Massachusetts and upstate New York, in western and eastern Pennsylvania, and other parts of the north and midwest parts of the United States. In other words, the agricultural plantation slave economy of the South is tied to the industrialization of the North. Where does the venture capital come from? Where do the loans come from so that new planters can go out and buy enslaved Africans, enslaved black folk, and bring them further south into Mississippi and Louisiana, Arkansas, and other places? It all comes out of that, out of the wealth generated from tobacco to begin with, tobacco and shipping and slave trade to begin with. But as you build on that with King Cotton, you now have the ability to use that money to speculate, to reinvest it in new plantations, new lands, new owners, and the shipment of slaves from old plantation owners in the upper South to new plantation owners in the deep South. So this all works together in some way, shape, or form to create an economy that is very dependent on slavery. The industrial economy, the agricultural economy, the plantation economy, the shipping economy, the domestic slave trade itself becomes very valuable. The stock exchanges, because because slaves are stock, they're part of the stock exchange. Some people have made the comparison of fantasy sports, fantasy football, fantasy baseball, fantasy hockey, fantasy basketball, etc., to trading, of stocks. That is to say that you see players as a commodity, and players who happen to be of African descent in particular. It's no different than seeing folks who are African as commodities from 150 or 200 years ago, right? So there's that comparison. So anyway, and so this period of time that we're talking about, particularly the first 30 years between 1790 and the 1820s, is the period where cotton emerges as a crop that has to eventually replace tobacco because these fields are exhausted. It's 150, 175 years of growing tobacco without doing things like crop rotation, growing alfalfa, letting land lie fallow for 3, 5, 10 years so that it can be replenished with nutrients. That doesn't take place in a profit-making industry of plantation, farming, because you're trying to profit every year, and because of that, you've worn out your soil. You've got natural growth of the number of enslaved people in your area you know of the milder climate, because of rape, because of you know natural childbirthing processes. You have lots and lots of slaves, and you don't have enough work for them because your plantation is less and less profitable year by year and decade by decade. Luckily, Eli Whitney comes along, and suddenly, lo and behold, there's a cotton gin for folks who are growing cotton further south in the Carolinas and Georgia and other places. Here's the problem with that. Do you really think that a 23-year-old graduate of Yale College, it's not a university yet, this is the 18th century, Yale College might as well be Loyola in terms of its reputation in 1793, right? It's a nice school, it's all right, but it's not Oxford. It's not Cambridge. It's not the Sorbonne in Paris. It's not any of those things. It's not even the University of Pisa, right? Which by the way has been around since like the 13th or 14th century. It's a nice school. It's a nice little school where you can, get your, become a pastor or a lawyer or whatever, but it's not really known for mechanical engineering. So he graduates, goes further south to work for the late Nathaniel Greene's wife, Catherine Greene, his widow, um, and observes enslaved blacks working cotton and trying to pick seed out, and lo and behold, he figures out by himself the entire process for what we would now call cotton ginning, except that it's a complete lie. More than likely, these slaves aren't stupid, right? Despite what people might think, these people are not stupid. They were probably using some version of what we would consider cotton ginning prior to this. It just wasn't fully mechanized or didn't have all the moving parts that you would need to do it at a grand scale, but they were using something because ginning had been around since the age of South Asians inventing ginning basically around, say, 500 CE, if not earlier. So they were using versions of that. And that equipment did not come with wire brushes. The key ingredient in Eli Whitney's process includes wire brushes to basically harshly brush out seeds and other materials out of the cotton so that you could gin it cleanly and straighten out the cotton bulb and turn it into first thread and then cloth, right? That's his little contribution, wire brushes. And so he patents this in 1794. At least two other planters steal it from him. Because he's probably stole it from enslaved folks to begin with. And by 1800, there are people using this stuff. Instead of ginning maybe a pound a day, you're able to gin 1,000 pounds or more of cotton per day per person. So the amount of cotton exported grows. 1790, U.S. exports 1.5 million pounds of cotton. By 1800, it's 33 million. By 1830, it's about 1 billion pounds. By 1860, you're pretty close to, it's 4 million bales, about 3 billion pounds worth of cotton. That's a lot of cotton, right? That would be great for our economy now. Forget about back then. So you need lots and lots of people to work fields in order to produce that much cotton, and that's what ends up happening as a result. And luckily, with the Louisiana Purchase and the expansion of folks into territories accumulated after the American Revolution, whether it's the Northwest Passage, Northwest territories or the territories that came with it in the South, parts of Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky, the Louisiana Purchase, which pushes you into Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, and other places. Eventually, slavery makes its way south. And with slavery making its way south, even before that, that means kicking out an awful lot of indigenous folks living in the South, including the 5 civilized tribes, losing their lands as Andrew Jackson and his cronies sweep through that part of the South in the 1810s and 1820s to drive these people, the Alabamans, the Mississippians, the Arkansasians, and other groups out of these territories. Yes, these states are actually named after indigenous tribes, not to mention the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Shawnee, the Choctaw, of which I happen to be, 2%, maybe 3% Native American as a result of that. And the Cree, they're all being pushed out to the point where they're being marched across the country to what becomes Indian country, or prior to 1889, but after 1889, eventually becomes the state of Oklahoma, right, through the Trail of Tears, so that these people can take the land, reuse it, use all the slaves that they've bought to basically turn this land into something workable, so that they can grow as much cotton as they want, or sugar as they want, or other products. And so that's mostly what we're talking about this week. I will reiterate some of this in terms of lessons, but this is you know this is how slavery survives. Slavery survives. Some people think slavery is a dying institution in the 1780s and 1790s, and maybe in some respects it actually is. But as we've already talked about in other contexts, George and Martha Washington weren't willing to give up their slaves in the 1790s, even though they were making less profit off of tobacco. Thomas Jefferson wasn't willing to give up his slaves at all. In his farm was less and less productive over time too. But once cotton comes along and comes to rule the growth in the entire American economy in some respects, no one's willing to give up slavery anymore. I mean, there's a handful that do in the 1780s and 1790s, but South in particular, but the country as a whole is kind of like, no, we got to make more money, we got to make more profit, we got to make more wealth, and you know these pieces of property that we have, these human pieces of property, are perfect for this. And so, the U.S. is kind of doomed to kicking the can of how to deal with slavery down the road again, out of wealth, profit, and power. And that's it for this week.